Hello everyone, I'm Lester Hernandez, and today I'll be talking about the user story that I selected for this sprint and basically the process that I went through to implement and complete this user story. My user story is related to the Pirates feed system. Um, this is basically a program that was partially implemented in previous versions of BreazeHome. The basic idea of how this program is supposed to work, it's conceptually it has five um, basic modules. Um, there is a module that retrieves data from the MLS. It basically requests the data from the MLS and receives a response. Then it passes that data to a parsing module, which basically does exactly what it says, is it parses the data into a model that can be actually migrated into our database. Then we call image processing module, which basically downloads images and stores them from the MLS into basically a directory that can be passed into the database. There is a geocoding module, which communicates, ideally would communicate with Google Maps API, and basically transforms the address that we receive from the MLS into Google Map coordinates, which we can use to actually calculate the distance between properties and the time that it would take for a person to travel to a certain property. And finally, there's a migration module, which is used to basically migrate all of this data into the BreazeHome database. My user story was user story number 2363. It basically dealt on basically implementing the geocoding to work with the Google Maps API. There was a previous version of the geocoding that was implemented to work with an outdated system. So it was decided that this new implementation of Pirates Feed would use the Google Maps API, since it takes care of basically authenticating an address format for us, and it can be easily implemented. Conceptually, the Pirates feed system would update the database with new property data automatically, but this is not implemented yet and is beyond the scope of my user story. It is important to know that in the current version of Pirates feed, the processing image module and geocoding module were not working, and the data migration was not being performed correctly because of a model discrepancy between the model used by Pirates feed to store data and the one actually used by the database. However, my user story dealt with performing geocoding functions in isolation, and I want to clarify that my user story did not deal with the performance of other modules, but only with the geocoding module and how it performed requests to the Google Maps API. The first step I took to basically complete this user story and implement the geocoding module was take a look at the Pirates feed code that was already written. It basically, the main parts of it consisted of a modules file written in Python. The whole Pirates feed program is written in Python. The models Python file basically consisted of all the objects and models that we would actually use to migrate the data into a database. These models needed to be consistent in both types and name of the fields with the database that we actually use in order for the migration to be performed correctly. And then all the code and all the functions of the Pirates feed system would basically be performed in the migrate file. This file consisted of a main method, which would then call a function to get the arguments. Which is found here. This function was written in order to customize the way that requests and the functions of the system would be performed. It includes a debugging mode, an amount of images to retrieve, whether or not to retrieve locations or images, basically a way to troubleshoot the operation of the program. Then it would go to a get table data, which basically would perform a request to the MLS system, and receive a response, which then we'll call the parse data method, which would basically do that, parse the data into our models, followed by a get image data and download images. These methods were not actually working at the beginning of the sprint, and they're actually being implemented by another teammate. As you can see, there is a function called upload data, that a method called upload data that is actually used later to perform the migration. There's a helpful method called get media, which has to deal with the images. And finally, this is where I implemented my user story, which is basically getting the location coordinates. So we basically iterate through every location object in our model that we pulled from the MLS and that we have already parsed. If it has an address, we basically append the address followed by a comma and the city. If it doesn't have an address, we just basically we fill we complete the field with only the city of the object sent. Then we basically do a request to the Google Maps API using our Google Maps API key. I explained a little bit more about this and how it works on the Google Maps geocoding API tutorial that I made. Then we geocode the address. We get a response. We pulled out the longitude and latitude of that object, that response, and then we will basically bring up the property field of the object that we're iterating and basically match it in our model. And for the point field, we'll basically populate it with the latitude and longitude. This would all be appended into a list that we created of locations. And we will repeat the same for every single address property, creating basically a list of objects that we can later return to basically start a migration. A migration basically what it does is it passes all images and locations and coordinates and all of that into our database. It uploads all of that data, uses the upload data method that we saw before. And basically that's where my user story fits into the whole Pirates feed application and model. This of course matches where the diagram that we previously saw, where we retrieve the data from the MLS, parse the data, and then retrieve images and perform geocoding, which is then migrated into our database. It is important to note that the process to come up with this code was basically the first step was researching and understanding how this Pirates feed application worked and the code that was written before. Then I went to the Google Maps geocoding API and I read all the documentation. More of that is shown, basically the general idea of it is shown in the video that I created to get started with the geocoding API. And finally, I wrote the code, which was actually simpler than expected, as the Google Maps geocoding API provided everything that I needed. There were no complications and the code actually worked as expected. It has been tested in isolation, as other features that are necessary to basically integrate the code and test the whole program are still in development. And as a side note, before I started working with this user story, it was expected that addresses, the actual code for addresses to be processed and make sure that the format of an address was correct, was to be implemented by me, but it turns out that Google already took care of that. So that basically reduced the complexity level that was expected for this actual user story. And I was able to finish it within the first week of the sprint. That's all for this user story. Thank you very much.